When I first came across the themes of duality and hybridity, they were in form of pictures, text, and sounds, of which I was ignoring the specific interrelation. Only later, analyzing this material entirely, I realized that every phenomenon that I was observing with attraction was the subtle expression of a dichotomy, carrying an hybrid significance. Right afterwards, it came the need to understand what the concept of duality implies and how it is related to space and architecture, generating the groundwork for the following study, which was itself built on the duality between philosophy and architecture. Interestingly, the idea of duality seems to occur in numerous implications of life, and as soon as I started reflecting on the concept, I quickly had in my hands an extensive list of antithetical binomials. And certainly, to consider this binary aspect of the world does not mean to minimize the complexity of the environment. Indeed, each binary antithetical relationship necessarily admits a plurality of hybrid and complex variations in between. Thereafter, I began to research the influence of these antithetical relationships in former philosophical and architectural theories, hence coming easily across postmodernism, with its features of contradictory and multiplicity. Robert Venturi, considered the father of postmodernism, wrote his architectural manifesto as an eulogy of the synthesis between antithetical elements, appearing therefore a suitable example to analyze in my research. To summarize, the present thesis aims to demonstrate that the concept of duality, and consequently hybridity and complexity, is intrinsic in the phenomenological environment, and have a decisive influence on our comprehension and fruition of the architectural as well as natural space. Once I came across the early values of postmodernism, such strongly related to the theme of duality, I felt necessary to analyze the topic from the abstract point of view, as to be able afterwards to understand fully its physical implications. Unexpectedly, it is difficult to identify the specific origins of such a theme, which not only crosses linearly the history of humankind, but also circularly connects different cultures, doctrines, and beliefs. First and foremost, it must be said that the concept of dualism belongs to a branch of philosophy named philosophy of mind, which investigates the ontology of the mind and its relation to the body. Through time, the intellectuals which approached the issue split into two major schools, monism and dualism, which themselves branched into several subcategories. Here, in a really concise explanation, we can mention that monism is the line of thought which accepts the prominence of only one principle. While contrarily, dualism claims that abstract and material phenomena derive from two separate principles which are opposite and irreconcilable. In Western society, the concept of dualism arose in several ancient philosophic theories. First, in the pre-Socratics, specifically in the Eleatic school with dialectics, gradually growing through Socrates and his theologic approach, until finding a powerful expression in Plato. Indeed, in Plato's philosophy, especially in the early texts known as Socratic dialogues, the idea of dualism could be seen as the fulcrum of his speculations on the meaning of life itself. Plato demonstrates, through the word of Socrates, his solid convictions that the human existence is encircled by the twofold reality, and moreover, he considered that every phenomenon derives, by some means, from its antithesis. In the symposium, he introduced the concept of a reconciliation of opposites, giving the example of music, and showing how harmony is the balance of high and low, and rhythm is the agreement of fast and slow elements. Now, the fact that balancing the contraries is the key process to generate harmony and rhythm, concepts that beside music are such strongly connected to architecture, allow us to picture the possible spatial implication of these ideas. Observing carefully, even the expedient of the dialogue and the use of dialectics, which Plato learned from Socrates and richly employed, are themselves linguistic tools built on an underlying dualism. In short, Plato believed that every phenomenon is inevitably connected with its opposite, and that the most mysterious of connections is between matter and mind, a connection such difficult to grasp that forced Plato towards a late idealism. The theories of Plato left the successor with more than one question, and therefore Aristotle, one of the most illustrious of his pupils, tried to solve these issues. And although he subverted Plato's ideas and tried to find a new unity in the dichotomy, he preserved his mentor's two-folded explanation of the phenomenological world. Aristotle, indeed, didn't accept Platonic forms, pure and independent from their embodiment, but instead he overturned the issue, asserting that forms are nothing but the basic essence and proprieties of things, and therefore exist incorporated in those. Despite these nearly physicalist principles, he maintained a dual view of the world, which he believed strongly characterized by dual forces that we confront with our senses, which are in fact the medium between the antipodes. Several centuries later, René Descartes, considered father of modern dualism, made the issue relevant again, due to the publication of his Meditation on First Philosophy in 1641. Throughout his text, he seemed to essentially reject the Aristotelian lessons in favor of a new Platonic pure dualism, assuming that the form can exist independently from its matter, and therefore considered superior. The Cartesian dualism, likewise Plato's idealism, conducted inevitably to a question without an answer. If the mind and matter are such different substances, how do they interact? Which is exactly the discrepancy that gave birth to further several critics and reinterpretations, generating the issue of interactionism. Following, several illustrious philosophers, among which Malebranche and Leibniz, attempted to give a solution to this inconsistency, yet they were not able to exclude the dogmatic intervention of God. On the other hand, in profound contrast with the interactionist theories, Spinoza disengaged from discarded ideas, suggesting a more complex vision where both matter and mind are inferior to a third substance. The issue of interaction between abstract and concrete, debated over and over, reached unsolved the movement of German idealism, when Hegel was finally able to build a stronger logic to explain the relationship between forms and phenomena through a dialectical process. Thereupon, Hegel found the key to moving beyond the other theories in the work of Fichte, a German idealist as well. Indeed, Fichte has previously given shape to his synthetical method, which suggested that two antithetical ideas do not necessarily nullify each other, but could be brought into agreement into the synthesis. This conception, thus, combines the opposites, revealing their reciprocal value and degree of truth. Likely, for Hegel, the dialectical moment brings the thesis and its extreme opposite in an antithetical comparison, while the speculative moment is the achievement of a brand new unitary concept, which encompasses both the former ones. Finally, it can be said that Hegel was able to explain the interaction between matter and mind by admitting that a dialectical world is possible to understand only for a reason which is dialectical itself. Besides, it is worth notice that while the concept of mind-matter dualism goes slowly disappearing after Hegel, the idea of duality kept living throughout history. Debating the issue, the philosopher oscillated on a swing between materialism and idealism, however, always inevitably recognizing some more and some less the underlying antithetical dichotomy. Hence, it fairly seems that monism, dualism, and pluralism are different answers to the same dual issue intrinsic in the world. Accordingly, Norbert Schulz wrote, "The concrete things which constitute our given world are interrelated in complex and perhaps contradictory ways. And yet, elegantly, the world around us keeps developing as a complex hybrid, generated by the overlapping of antithetical tensions. We can take advantage of a clear example such as light and darkness. Therefore, as evinced by the scheme, between pure light and pure darkness takes place a plurality of different degrees of shadows, as well as a multitude of degrees between hot and cold, and yet a variety of heights between tall and short. Moreover, the superimposition of these pluralities creates the contradictory complexity which characterizes the natural milieu." Now, I found significant to outline the physical implication of dualities and their relevance in everyday life. Thereupon, I found truly instructive The Architecture of Water, an essay written by Charles Moore. The article, indeed, discusses how the contradiction between stillness and movement, or land and water, is capable to impact on our state of mind, and specifically due to a certain value of water. In fact, a stream can suggest a mountain far away and the mysterious depths of the sea. Thus, a sense of somewhere else seems to arise from the contrast between the perpetual moving of water and the reliable stillness of land. As a result, we could dare to observe that this psychological engagement does not derive merely from the particular contrast between stillness and movement, but instead it appears to draw from the influence that any contradiction in itself has on our perception of space. In conclusion, to a certain extent, human perception and fruition of both natural and urbanized places are affected by a series of dual antithetical forces. Furthermore, these binomials takes on a value in architecture, which typically combines art and science, as well as inside and outside, public and private, form and function, and so on. A significant part of the architects connected with the postmodern values attached great importance to the complexity of contradictory tensions, enhancing the importance of plurality. Thereby, although duality and consequently complexity and hybridity are ideas which had often in history assumed an architectural meaning, during the postmodern years these notions are embraced with a new enthusiasm, arising both from the will to transcend the former modern movement and from the prosperous historical conditions of the post-war period. According to Jenks, postmodernism is mainly divided in three stages. The rise of postmodernism began in 1950, when the first critics arose, pointing out the discrepancies that emerged from the modernist movement. Indeed, the new generations of architects seem to seek a different, renewed freedom, due mostly to the tragic effects of the association of modern architecture with modernization. Therefore, the discontent for the implication of modern architecture started spreading through most countries around the world. It must be said that this state of unrest was not diffusing only in the architectural field, but also in several other disciplines, forasmuch it was strongly related to the atmosphere of trembling sense of freedom and revolution distinctive of those years. Specifically, an architecture which displays ad hoc characteristic of this period was Lucien scroll buildings for students in Belgium, full of ornament, humor, metaphor, and looking in their vital jumble altogether like a constructed version of May 1968. The second and prosperous phase of postmodernism saw the rise of its values and ideas, especially after the occurrence of few publications. An eclecticism started spreading quickly, and the principle of plurality and juxtaposition of contraries grew in the approach of several artists. The current reached its apex a few years later, when in 1980s the first International Architectural Biennale took place in Venice. Indeed, the architectural exhibition, named The Presence of the Past, focused its attention on the already widely spread postmodern movement. The main exhibit, directed by Paolo Portoghesi and named Strada Novissima, displayed a series of 20 facades, conceived as theater wings for a hypothetical postmodern street. In the composition of these facades, indeed, elements of ancient history were juxtaposed to the modern architectural morphology and techniques, resulting in a lively tension between classicism and modernity, as well as humans and built space. This event, and the previous episode of Aldo Rossi's Teatro del Mondo, along with the work of several architects such as Michael Graves and James Stirling, brought the current to the peak of its fame and expansion. Once the apex was reached in the 80s, the decline of the movement started slowly. In a few years, postmodern aesthetic principles spread in many fields, invading public and private spaces in form of teapots and stools, and quickly turning into a fashion. Yet, often, even postmodernists detached themselves from these late aesthetical expressions. In conclusion, we could say that postmodernism arose from a need for freedom of expression which, as far as I am concerned, deeply drove from the socio-political milieu of those years. Thus, the vivacious architectural pluralism seemed to perfectly express the underlying exigency of transcending the modernist movement, which was for a long time aligned with autocratic politics, inexorable industrialization, and towering desire for economic growth. Apparently, according to few different sources, Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture by Robert Venturi has been the most accurate manifesto of postmodernism. In the beginning of the text, he engagingly draws an overview of the principle of complexity and ambiguity, while subtly criticizing the modern architectural approach. Yet, he makes rather clear that his architectural view is resolutely focused on a synthetical process in which opposites come to be together, almost as there was a human need for an ambiguous architecture. Moreover, Venturi writes that even the modernist concept of flowing universal space has implied being outside when inside and inside when outside, rather than both at the same time. Throughout the book, Venturi analyzed several works from a vast and heterogeneous series of architects, from Michelangelo and Borromini to Le Corbusier and Louis Kahn. Thus, the strength of his text is the ability to find and exalt the presence of a contradictory duality in works which belong to the similar timeframes and movements, hence appearing universal and ineluctable. Yet, Venturi was aiming to obtain a richness of meaning instead of a clarity of meaning, willing to achieve a difficult whole in which the opposites are brought together to create a lively hybrid, a superimposition of antithetical tensions. In Venturi's opinion, the tool of superimposition is inclusive as it contains opposites within a whole, thus relating antithetical elements. The superadjacency permits a multiplicity of levels of meaning. And to support these ideas in the book, the architect brings the example of Palazzo del Popolo in Ascoli Piceno, which is enriched by the superadjacency of different ages. The elevation of Palazzo del Popolo deals with the violent adjacencies and superadjacencies of open and closed arcades, continuous and interrupted steering courses, big and little windows, porte and portone, and clocks, cartouche, balconies and storefronts. All of these produce broken rhythms and reflect the contradictory dualities of public and private, ordered and circumstantial scales. A built example of Robert Venturi's beliefs is in the residence of Chestnut Hill, designed in 1959, and perhaps one of the early buildings which opened the way to postmodernism. Indeed, this modest house incorporates complexity and contradictions, being at the same time complex and simple, open and closed, big and little, and therefore bringing the oppositions into dialogue. On one hand, the spaces inside the house are intricate and distorted in shape and relationship, accommodating the complexity of the domestic necessities. On the other hand, the composition of the outside is simple and consistent, representing the public scale of the building. The front elevation, indeed, combines traditional elements, generating an almost symbolic image of a house. However, the opposition between outside and inside is not absolute. The plan as a whole embraces the coherence of the outside, while the facade discloses the inner distortions through the arrangement of the voids. At this point, it is possible to notice a substantial interest of Venturi and consequently several other postmodernists for one of the primary dualities in architecture, inside and outside. Usually, when we first walk into an architecture, the experience we go through is mostly emotional. We absorb the characteristics of the spaces unconsciously. Still, there are spaces where we feel right to stand in, just waiting, and spaces in which arise the need to move and walk towards a direction. Yet, there are spaces where we feel constrained and other ones which leave us exposed. The manner in which a space opens up to the outside or hides from it influences directly the way light enters the said space, and thus it gives an identity to that place. And the way we perceive the places around us is strongly influenced by the way the contradictory forces of architecture build this identity. Hence, our perception of the architectural space is powerfully related to the dialogue between solids and voids, and therefore between darkness and light. Other two examples interesting to analyze are Aldo Rossi's Bonnefanten Museum and Louis Kahn's approach in Ahmedabad Institute for Management. Aldo Rossi was one of the most influential architects of postmodernism. He indeed often applied the values of complexity and hybridity to its architectural work. In the project for the Bonnefanten Museum, the architect gained control over the user's experience and perception of the space, balancing the dialogue between openings and occlusions, and using the tool of natural light to influence the movement of the visitors. For example, the significant central stairwell is fully pervaded by the daylight coming from the transparent ceiling, generating a feeling of a covered street. In addition, if we compare this postmodern approach to the modern approach of Mies van der Rohe in the project of New National Gallery, which instead has its strength in the total transparency and absence of partitions, it is easy to notice the implication of the different methods used to handle the duality between inside and outside. Louis Kahn's approach was similar to Aldo Rossi's view, but again different. Kahn was not really a pure modernist, nor a postmodernist. However, he believed that the architectural space should be based on the balance between form and function, and yet between inside and outside. Explaining his project in Ahmedabad, he admits that if he had thought only from a functional point of view, he would have made brise-soleil to screen the sun, but instead he chose to implement enclosed porches, which became rooms, hence in-between places. Moreover, Kant sees the natural light as the thing which makes a room have its nature, as for instance, one has north light and another receives light from southeast. Therefore, the openings of each space should be designed differently and appropriately for each specific place. And lastly, although we rightfully call these values postmodern, the history of such ideas is far more rooted in the past. In point of fact, this awareness seems to transcend the architectural labels. Without any doubt, the criticism of postmodernism during the years were many and hectic, mainly focusing on the postmodern use of ornament and symbolism, implying that their architecture was moved only by aesthetic means. And certainly, postmodernism was driven by the need to overcome the pure and linear modern architecture. However, the enthusiasm which brought to the demolition of the form follows function instance several times brought to the affirmation of the opposite approach. In addition, the vastness of the term postmodernism makes difficult to individuate a unitary aesthetic, drawing an ever more intricate scenery. Manfredo Tafuri criticized the postmodern approach, and specifically Venturi, implying that the architectural ambiguity was mistakenly seen as an a priori category, and therefore used only to justify personal planning choices, rather more equivocal than ambiguous. He blamed how Venturi turned the analytical methods directly into compositive methods, making the complexity a starting point. And unquestionably, even if the postmodern approach could be seen as odd and exaggerate, yet it is also fair to consider the historical need for a powerful and controversial architectural language. And besides the more eclectic manifestations of postmodernism, their aim for a human and inclusive architecture proves the point of failure of the modern movement. Hence, this gives us the idea that in the same way modernism was the proper revolution at the beginning of the 20s and consequently became outdated in the 50s, likewise, postmodernism was the appropriate rebellion needed in the 60s, 70s, until becoming obsolete as well, as to leave room for the new architectural principles to come. In conclusion, it seems fair to make a comparison between philosophical and architectural approaches to the theme. Indeed, modernists, with an almost dogmatic approach, admit only a unitary clear architectural language, resembling the metaphysical approach of idealism, while postmodernists argue against this unitary vision in favor of a dialectic one, in which the vivid juxtaposition of extreme opposites aims to a difficult whole, appearing in line with the Hegelian synthetical dialectic. Furthermore, exactly as said for the philosopher, which gave different answers to the same intrinsic dual question, in the same way architects provided the spectrum of different spatial answers to the inevitable dualities innate in architecture. Secondly, aligning my thought with the critics to the concept of flowing universal space, I made few considerations on how this concept has been transposed into contemporary architecture, evolving, for my part, in a sort of an obsession for transparency. Truly, the technological development made humans able to ignore the dual relationship between architecture and the environment, therefore between inside and outside. Today, we dare to build glass villas in the middle of the desert, and buildings such tall that using the stairs becomes perhaps an impossible venture. This controversial scenario is stunning if we consider how much autonomy we gained, but frightening if instead we ponder the lost focus on the human scale and the emotional impact of architectural choices, especially in the relationship between inside and outside. And lastly, I would like to close this investigation saying that architecture is itself a synthetic activity, and apart from being a tool that mediates contradictory forces, it is also an astonishing instrument to entice people's interaction. Architecture is itself a hybrid discipline, not entirely a science nor fully an art, thereby arising from a balance of opposites. To conclusively express my position, I will only say in medio stat virtus, or with the words of Horace, est modus in rebus.